Down to business.
That's the nectar of the gods, baby.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the #1 liquid lubricated, liquid fueled show on the interwebs. This is the Whiskey Musings broadcast, and I am your truth seeking host, Rick. So we've had a lot of things happen this week in terms, and last week, in terms of the scene of politics. But one of the things that has predominantly popped up over the course of time has been the Georgia voter ID law. And one of the things that is sort of in opposition to it is the fact that most minorities or even like underprivileged folks who are out there in America do not have an ID. That's one of the opposing viewpoints. And because of this ID, this ID issue, it leads to voter suppression. Now, earlier this week, I put out a meme where it basically said, take your position. I mean, I'm going to paraphrase here, but take your position, and as a intelligent person, you are open to the possibility of being incorrect, and that you go through and you research and that kind of stuff in order to kind of, make sure that your position is valid. So from my perspective, my position basically is, I've had an ID pretty much most of my adult life, if not all of it, whether it was, a driver's license, a military ID, and now even today, it's like, I use a passport for doing international travel and things like that. So for me, as an example, I sit there and I look at it and I go, well, how in the heck can anybody live in this world without an ID? So from my side of the house, I'm like, this is ridiculous. It just makes sense to use an ID for voter rolls to ensure that the person who votes actually is the person who is voting. But I decided to kind of question that because I know that I may not be within the group of the norm. And so I did a little research, and tonight I'm going to kind of go through my thought process and go through some of the things that I found. Now, understand this is not going to be, complete in any way, shape, or form, because I do try to keep this to an hour. But hopefully, I'll be able to come up with, a few arguments. You'll be able to kind of see where my thought process went during the course of this week. But before I get into that, I definitely have to pass on to my watchers and viewers a big hearty thank you, because honestly, without you, this wouldn't be here, because you have to watch, and I appreciate the fact that you are taking a little bit of time out of your day to come and sit with me and to listen to what I have to say. And I appreciate that. I want to thank you for that. I keep pointing that out every week, and I'm going to keep pointing it out every week. I know I haven't pushed it in the last couple of episodes, but if you go to the description in the channel, not in the video, but in the channel description, you'll find a link that goes to the Whiskey Musings store where you can pick up Whiskey Musings logo gear. I would appreciate it. All the proceeds come directly to supporting the show directly, not me personally, but supporting the show directly, like paying for the service that I use for phone calls. So let's go ahead and get started. First thing I'm going to do is I'm going to, this video, I'm going to show a video here. And this video is one of those videos that I think a lot of people have seen. The video itself was done in 2016. And it basically, the gentleman who does it, he does a lot of videos like this. He takes a premise and he goes to the streets and he just starts asking people on the street. In this particular case, the gentleman is Ari Horowitz. And if I'm mispronouncing your name, sir, I apologize completely. But what he is doing is he goes out to, in this particular video, he goes out to Berkeley in particular, I believe, and starts asking some random college students a little bit about voter ID and whether or not it is racist or leads to voter suppression. Now, keep in mind, I kind of want to not talk about the racism part of this, although it does play into the topic only because of the fact that it seems to be a very large piece of the pie when discussing things like minorities and people of low incomes and that kind of thing. Just because of the fact that it seems to be a common theme that people are throwing out there, that people who are not of the white ethnicity tend to have issues when it comes to getting any kind of ID that would be used for a voting identification, as an example. So I want to play this video, and I think I've got it queued up. Give me just a second. Let me get to here we go. Okay, so I'm going to play this video, and I want you to kind of watch this. I'm only going to play the first half of it at first, and you'll see why once I get to the other side of it. But go ahead and take a listen to the video, and let's see what we can find out here.
I'm Ari Horowitz, and I'm here in Berkeley, California to find out if voter ID laws suppress the black vote. Do you have an opinion on voter ID laws?
Yeah, they're usually pretty racist and they're bad.
I think voter ID laws are a way to perpetuate racism.
Would you go as far as say those laws are racist?
For sure.
Do you think it suppresses the African American vote?
Definitely.
Tell us how.
Because they're less likely to have state IDs.
Minority voters are less likely to have the kinds of IDs that have been described or required.
These type of people don't live in areas with easy access to DMVs or other places where they can get identification.
You can always get IDs you do over the internet. Does that also make it difficult for black people in particular?
Yeah, you have to have access to the internet. You have to be able to pay an internet service provider for certain fees.
Do you think that's harder for black people to go online?
Well, I feel like they don't have the knowledge of how it works.
A lot of people have smartphones, but you might not have data.
For most of the communities, they don't really know what is out there just because they're not aware or they're not informed.
I also think there's a repression of black voting with how if you're a convicted felon, you're not allowed to vote and everything. And when you look at swing states like Florida, that's a huge population of the African Americans.
Okay, so I'm going to stop it right there because that frames the premise of what we're talking about. I mean, it seems like a lot of people are, at least in this particular case, a lot of people are thinking that in particular, African Americans, I mean, that's the way Ami is putting it on. But one of the things that got me to thinking about this is like I said, I've grown up with ID. I've been ID'd. My parents had IDs. I've constantly had identification of some form, whether it was, state issued, government issued, federal government issued, I should say. I've always had it. So I had to go and take a look. I had to ask the question. And so what I did is I did a quick search on the internet and I popped up to this, and I'm going to kind of zoom in a little bit here. So I found this poll, I guess, or this research. They call it a research memo from Project Vote, and it was from February of 2015 is when it was published. And they did an Americans with photo ID. You got to keep in mind that's photo ID. A breakdown of demographic characteristics. So this person, Vanessa Perez, among a couple others, went ahead and did this research project. And what they essentially did is they tapped into data from another organization. And I'm losing my mind here, but hold on. From the American National Election Studies. And what this organization has done is they've done basically polling for every vote that we have, that we've taken, and they do polling and afterthought polling and things like that. And they put together this data and they offer it up. It is a conglomeration from the University of Michigan and I think Cornell or something like that. You can hit the link and get to my exact, get to the exact position or exact place to find this out. But what they do is they've taken this data and they've kind of culled through it, and they've come up with a couple of things that I kind of found a little interesting. And I think this might be where a lot of people are taking a look and getting the idea that minorities don't have ID in order to vote. So, the first thing that they did is they culled through the data and actually, yeah, I'll get to that here in just a minute. I'll get to something else. Sorry, I had a thought run through my mind, and I'll get to it in just a minute. So let's take a look at this particular research memo that was published. And one of the things that they did, and I'll blow this up for you, is, whoa, that's a little too much. So one of the things that they did is they culled through the data that was presented as a part of the AMES, and they basically kind of broke it out based on ethnicity, but they did it by individuals who have confirmed ID. Now, notice they say confirmed ID. So this ID could be in the form of a passport, a driver's license. It could also be in the form of just a state-issued ID that isn't a driver's license, as an example. And one of the things that they found, or that they've noticed, is that based on the percentage of the population, now this is expanded because the sample size is and I'll show you the sample size numbers here in a minute, but the sample size isn't like everybody in the U.S. Okay, so that's the first thing to understand. A lot of these studies don't have a very large sample size typically, and so some of this stuff is expanded in order to come up with the numbers that we're dealing with here. But one of the things that you'll notice here is that of the people who had confirmed ID or no confirmed ID broken down by race, you have whites, blacks, Hispanics, others, and then don't know. If you'll look, you'll notice that it appears, at least from the numbers, that white individuals or people who identify as white confirmed that they have an ID 95% of the time. And 5% of the time they confirm that they don't have any form of identification. If they identified as black, it's 87 and 13. Hispanics are closer to whites by 90%, 10%, and then others are 89 and 11. But you kind of see the picture. I mean, there does appear to be a bit of a disparaging difference when you look at these numbers of, whites versus other ethnicities. And so I found that kind of interesting because one thing that they did state in this particular or at the website that I got this from, they kind of mentioned that this seems to be a rough estimation across all years, that it doesn't change that much with confirmed ID versus non-confirmed ID. It doesn't change that much over the course of the years that they've been doing this. It's roughly somewhere in the realm of like 12 to 15% for African Americans, roughly in the realm of 10%. So this does appear to be standardized data across the board when it comes to, how this is broken out. So the next thing that they did is they broke it out based by household income. And let me blow this up a little bit for you. So they took essentially all of those numbers and they said, okay, well, is economic a factor? Are there economics involved here? And if you'll take a look and you'll notice that it appears that if you're in the below 25,000 bracket, 25,000 household income per year, that you would be confirmed would be 88%, non-confirmed would be 12. When you start moving up, those numbers change and they vary a little bit, but at least they get to be above 90% most of the time within those income brackets. So based on these numbers, you could make the inference that having a low income, you are less likely to have some sort of government issued ID. Now, again, keep in mind, this is just collaboration of numbers. Okay. So I'm not trying to bring any sort of, final thought as a part of this, but they also went and did another graph, and they broke it out by age. Now, this is a little interesting, mainly because of the fact that they started off at like 17. So, I know that certain states may have different voting ages, but generally speaking, by 18, you are voting. In most cases, most states that I'm aware of, somewhere in the realm of like 16 to 17, you are going to be able to be eligible to get a driver's license. So therefore, that's part of the reason why they threw it in this age group. So you start taking a look at the age group itself, and 17 to 20, 85% had ID, 15% not. When you got a little higher, 21 to 24, you got to 89%, 11%. So it kind of grew a little bit, and generally speaking, the numbers stayed above 90 once you hit age 25. Now, one thing to kind of keep in mind is that there are two significant events that I can think of in any person's life, generally speaking, where ID is very important. The first one, obviously, is to be able to drive a car. The second one, obviously, is being legal to drink. There are other reasons for requiring an ID, one of which would be going into the military. You can go in at age 18 or 17 with parental consent. So there are certain places in life, especially in early life, that you are going to be required to have some sort of identification. And so that kind of gives you, like, the lower age groups, the lower age brackets, it doesn't correlate that they have these ID, this kind of larger gap in percentages. However, that being said, generally speaking, the younger you are, the less likely you're going to encounter situations where you would need some sort of ID, because obviously you need it, again, to get alcohol, to be able to apply for a job, be able to apply for benefits, be able to, there's like a whole list, and I'll show a list later of potential uses for where ID becomes important. So they continue on and they do this, they break this out. Now, in this case, instead of just ID, they actually bring up the specificity of a driver's license or a passport. Now, they break this out by ethnic background. And I'm going to be honest with you, I did not get a passport. I've had a driver's license since I was 17, but I did not get a passport until I had to get one. I absolutely had to get one for my other job. So even in the military, I did not have a passport because technically my military ID was my passport. Okay, so we have to kind of think about that. But in this chart, you can see where, again, there seems to be a huge difference once you hit the driver's license and the passport, because you start off as a person of Caucasian ethnicity. Okay, we'll call it white. 91% of them had a driver's license or a passport. 8% didn't have either one of them. And then if you look at the African-American slot, you look at 73% had a driver's license or a passport, and 27% had neither. Now, that's an interesting and significant jump. And then you start looking at Hispanic, and you start looking at other, you also have some refused amounts. But that disparaging difference going from 91% having a driver's license or a passport, so and then to 73% for an African American, based on this study, you look at that and you have to kind of scratch your head, because again, the first numbers that I showed you where, the numbers weren't that far off, they mentioned that it's just an ID. Now you have the specificity of the driver's license or the passport. And so you have to kind of ask yourself, and this study actually did not bring this particular piece up, but it was something that I caught and I was like, this is interesting. So what potentially could be causing it to where an individual would have a standard state-issued ID, but not a driver's license or a passport? And so what I did is I kind of thought about that, and I'm like, you know what? The only thing that makes sense to me, and I'm prepping up for the next screen, the only thing that makes sense to me is if there is a specific reason as to why somebody does not need a driver's license or a passport. And so what I did is I said, what could be the possible reason? And the first thing I thought of is, well, if you're living in a city, and especially a big city like Los Angeles, New York, Baltimore, Chicago, Detroit, a lot of those cities have public and mass transportation, and a lot of those cities don't have a lot of parking in their downtown areas. So I'm kind of like, all right, well, what could be a good way to actually find out where people of certain ethnicities live? And so what I did is I actually found a demographic map. Sorry, I got an itch. Demographic map that was based off of the 2010 census data. And hopefully I got this. Whoops. Nope. Wrong one. Hold on. I don't have that queued up here properly, I don't think. Let's see. Yes. Okay. So I went out and I found this, and this link is actually in the description. And so I started looking at where certain ethnicities were living based in the U.S. And so one of the things that you'll notice in this map is that, first of all, there's white is in blue. You can see down here in the, oh, no, you can't because I'm in the way. Okay, let me get out of the way for you here because I just noticed that. All right. So if you look down in the lower corner where I used to be, you could see where the color differentiator. So there's, whites are the blue dots, African Americans are the green, Asian or white, or Asian or red, Hispanics are orange, and those that are of mixed or identify as mixed are in purple. So if you look at this, you'll notice that there's a lot of green, and I'm going to highlight my cursor here. There's a lot of green running throughout the South. But the other thing that you'll notice too is that green shows up in some larger cities. For an example, here around Chicago, there's a lot of green. Down here around, Indianapolis, down here in the corner, you've got green over here in Detroit. You have a lot of green around Cleveland. You've got more green around, Washington, D.C. and Arlington, Virginia, New York. So, one possibility where people wouldn't necessarily need a driver's license would have to be a potential where they're constantly congregating in places where public mass transit does exist and where you do not need a car, nor would you necessarily want a car, because I can tell you that having a car in like New York City, it would be astronomical for just the parking alone, not to mention the fact I've experienced traffic there. You don't go anywhere. I mean, when it's rush hour, it is literally the jokes that you see in the movies or the comments that you see in the movies where, people are like packed in. If you get into certain areas of New York, it can get that way. You could be sitting for a very long time in certain cases. So that made me think that what I was actually doing, and I'm trying to bring up the other screen here. Hold on. So that kind of supported my idea that, and I got to get the right one here. Let's pop that up. Okay. So that kind of supported my idea that maybe there's something more to it than just than just, not having a driver's license or whatever. So from that perspective, I was kind of like, okay, well, that sort of makes sense, because now you have a potential as to why there would be an issue with driver's licenses, passports not being that high up on the list, and having neither one also being a higher number than just the generic ID might come into play. And so I thought, okay, well, that's a potential plausible explanation for this. Okay, so I'm not saying that is the explanation. I'm just saying that is a plausible explanation. So then the next thing that they did, or the next thing that I keyed in on, so there were a couple other charts in here, and if you want to read through the document, it's not that long. It's actually a bunch of charts and stuff, but if you look through the document, they popped up a chart, and I'll pull this up, where they said, okay, well, those who don't have a driver's license, or those that do have a driver's license or passport, how does this break out by income if you are African American ethnicity? And so I kind of found, and this is interesting, if you look through this chart here, you'll see that the breakdown of people based on their income, it changes, but it's kind of all over the board. It's like up and down, up and down, up and down. And so you kind of have to ask yourself, okay, well, if the reason why they don't have a driver's license or a passport doesn't appear to have any correlation to their income level or their reported household income, then what realistically would be the reason? And I believe, even though I can't verify any of this, but I believe that there is something else going on here. It has nothing to do with being low income, or it doesn't have anything in terms of a driver's license or a passport. It doesn't have it. There is something else at play here than just, an income related requirement or something like that. And so because they don't break this study down by geographic region, we do not know realistically how this is broken down and why. But one potential thing I could think of right off the top of my head is that, first of all, these people may not need a passport. I know I didn't need one until I went on international travel within the last 10 years. So and most people don't have a passport. They really, at least none that I am aware of actually have a passport unless they try to go overseas. Now, one thing that's interesting is we're coming up to and this is sort of a public service announcement in a way, but we're coming up to the point where you're going to need some form of governmental ID, even if you want to fly domestically within the U.S. As a part of the Real ID Act, you need to have an approved form of ID. Now, I just went through this because I actually went and renewed my driver's license. And as a part of that, I went ahead and got my alternate or enhanced license here in this state, because this state, the standard driver's license, does not meet the requirements for the Real ID Act by the federal government. And that's kicking over in October of 2021. Now, I know they've pushed it out. So, potentially it could get pushed out again. But the reality of it is that if you are flying domestically, you're going to have to present a government issued passport, whether that's a government issued ID, whether that is a U.S. passport or a Real ID license. And I've even had TSA sit there and tell me that, no, your ID isn't going to work anymore. I've had them tell me that. So that makes it sort of interesting from the standpoint of looking at it and saying, all right, well, what could this be? And not that I'm necessarily discounting, potential problems, but it kind of makes you wonder. So one of the things that we need to do when we're looking at studies like this is we have to look at where their data sets come from. Because if we don't understand where the data set comes from, how can we make any meaningful inferences out of the number? And so what I did is I went back in and I took a look at where this ANES time study came from. And this is for the 2012 data set that was in that article or in that report. And one thing that I want to point out is if you look here, the number of respondents is just a little over 2,000 for the face-to-face sample. And down here on the, they did allow people to use the internet to respond as well. But if you look down here, there's just under 4,000. So what we're talking about here is roughly 4,014, I think, if my calculation is correct here. Maybe not. No, just under 5,000. Wait a minute. Sorry, just under 6,000 people. Okay, somewhere between 5,000 to 6,000. My math is off. had a drink or two. But anyway, the point is that this is a very small sample size. Okay, so in the grand scheme of things, they've done a lot of extrapolation out of these numbers. So to be completely honest, whenever you do that type of thing, the margin of error rate goes up when you start extrapolating numbers. And I know that's a little bit math. It's a little heavy for maybe somebody who might be drinking a little bit. But the big key here is to understand that that particular study may not be 100% reflective. However, it does speak to certain trends and certain scenarios where having an ID or not having an ID might become a big factor when it comes to things like voter ID. So let's ask the question, when are voter IDs when are valid IDs required? And so, obviously the most obvious ones are driving, that kind of thing. But somebody posted this meme, and I'm not exactly 100% sure if all of these are correct because I haven't done all of these things recent history. However, that being said, I can tell you that things like driving, boarding an airplane, purchasing a car, doing a car registration, doing any kind of renting of a car in particular, I'm not quite sure about buying insurance. I guess that would depend on what kind of insurance you're doing, but definitely obtaining a passport. And I'm not going to read through all of these, but as you can see from the list, there is a bunch of things that would require some kind of government ID. Now, that study is sort of presenting the idea that maybe potentially, and the questions that are being asked and a lot of the people in like Ami's video is showing that a lot of people believe that there's a disparaging difference here. And what I'm looking at based on these numbers is that maybe it's not as yes, there is a potential problem. There are people who don't have ID, but this doesn't necessarily mean that the reason why they don't have ID is anything related to something such as racism, as an example. It could be something as simple as, I don't need a driver's license because I don't own a car. I live in a city and I take public transit. I take subway systems and things like that. So I only need the ID to do something that is like on this list. That's like on this list back here. So is it really, really that hard for somebody to go get an ID? And something that I didn't think about, because again, I haven't lived in a lot of remote areas, but I did see one study or one potential study that did talk about certain states don't have as many driver's license locations. And there was also some suggestion that somebody who might be of lower income has to work 2 jobs or whatever in order to make ends meet. And so therefore they don't have the time to take off to go, not to mention actually pay for the voter ID or the ID period, I should say, not the valid ID. So that could potentially be an issue. And, going back to those numbers, if you go back to the numbers that I was showing you in terms of the household income here, if you look at this, confirmed ID versus non-confirmed ID based on household income, there's, pretty much almost everything with the exception of the below 25,000. Even then, you still have a lot of confirmed IDs. You have a lot of people who have confirmed that they have ID. And I think the reason for that is because of the fact that there are a lot of things that you need ID for. So having ID is definitely more advantageous than not. Now, I do know that there are certain states that have potential, voter potential ID laws. And so that was something that came up. And let me go ahead and bring that up. So I was asking myself, okay, well, how systemic really is this kind of a situation across the United States? How many of these states do actually have voter laws where they would require ID in effect? And so one of the places that I went to take a look at this, and I got to find where did that go? Huh. Okay. Oh, that must be, okay. I know what that is. Anyway, so one of the places that you can get this information, I did put the link in. I think it's the National Council of State Legislatures, the NCSL, I believe it's called. The link is in the description. So anyway, what I did is I went there and I said, okay, how many states actually have voter identification laws? And this is what they have as a map. And now this is just an image, but it is an actual interactive map. And if you wanted to go to it and like roll over one of these states to try and figure this out, you could see what is required. And they also have a listing of what's required. Now, if you'll notice, there's 36 total states that have some type of voter identification law in effect. It changes a little bit, though, as to whether or not it has to be just a straight up photo ID, whether it has to be just a straight up, doesn't matter if the photo's on it, whether the photo ID is requested, whether an ID is requested but a photo's not required, and then, of course, whether or not there's any documentation required to vote. And if you look at this, there's 36 states that have this. 35 of them were in operation during the 2020 during the 2020 election, because I think it's Virginia. Virginia had it, but I think it was Virginia. Virginia had it, but then either Virginia or West Virginia had it, but then they had sort of a suspension of it for some reason. Anyway, the website tells you all that. But if you look at this map, the ones that have strict voter IDs, you've got Georgia, Mississippi, Tennessee, Kansas. Those are all in the South, and those are all part of that band of where you saw the band of green on that other map in terms of population. So it's kind of interesting that, the argument being made may not be as prevalent, first of all, as prevalent of an issue. But the other thing is that even if it is potentially an issue, the areas where they've already got voter identification laws are where people of certain ethnic backgrounds are going to reside who potentially, already have voter or have some type of identification. So whether or not this is a racist issue or not, I'm not even going to comment on. But it makes you wonder. It really does. It makes you sit here and you think, okay, well, if this is the argument that's being made, how real is the argument? And again, I didn't know because, again, I'm down on the side where I'm like, hey, having an ID is something that's just a part of natural life. But it turns out I was slightly wrong on that, and the fact that there are people who don't have things like a driver's license. However, that being said, the predominant number of Americans, and granted, we have, 10%. If you take 330 million Americans, we have 10% that don't have, roughly, that don't have voter ID, or I'm sorry, not voter ID, but some sort of ID period. If you're looking at roughly 10%, that's roughly 33 million people if my numbers are rounding correctly. So that still is an issue. But one thing that the news media didn't talk about, especially in regards to the Georgia law, was that they provided free IDs. They were saying, hey, if you want an ID, if you want to vote, then come and vote. Now, that actually is an interesting question, because even though we have close to 300 million people, roughly, assuming people of voting age, I did cut off some, and I'm just using some random numbers here, so don't quote me on the numbers. But if we have roughly 300 million adult-aged people, there are reports that are saying that our actual registered voters are roughly 60% of that. So that begs the question, 60%, well, how in that case is it possible that maybe potentially these people who don't have ID literally don't want to or don't care to vote? Now, that is one thing that I found sort of an interesting question, and I didn't really find anybody that has necessarily studied that in depth. However, there was a study, and I don't have a screenshot of it, but there was a study. It is in the link. It was done by Reuters, and they basically interviewed roughly 20,000, maybe a little more than 20,000 people. And they asked them basically, do you have some sort of identification? And the numbers came out a little strange. They were a little different than the other numbers in terms of they were heavily weighted. I mean, we're talking like 95% plus, regardless of ethnic background, in terms of having a voter ID versus not having, having an identification period of some type that could be used as voter ID versus the numbers that didn't. Now, the interesting thing that they don't have in terms of numbers, but they do mention it in the article, is the fact that people who don't have identification apparently seemed, anecdotally, to not care about voting. And so, considering the position that another study that I read took, where the number of young people are the highest number of people who don't have any sort of identification, then it stands to reason that that same group of people will be the ones that would be less likely to vote. And I thought about that, and I can tell you that in my younger years, I actually didn't really start voting until a little bit later in life. And I think that tends to be true, or potentially tends to be true, across the board. Because when you're young, you don't necessarily think about things like voting. You don't think about things like what potentially is going to affect your life down the road, because, you know, you're not necessarily. So here's one of the big things is that voting kind of ties in towards taxes. And if you're not paying taxes, if you're getting tax returns, then you may not be as inclined to vote for things like increase in taxes or decrease in taxes. So that may not be a motivator for you to go out and actually go to vote. It's sort of an interesting conundrum. And I'll be honest with you, I didn't, I thought that everybody had IDs. I said that before, and I'll say it again. I thought everybody did. It appears that there is at least a segment of the population, even older population, that may not have them. And so I was incorrect in the assumption that that having an ID would potentially, not stop somebody from voting. It is possible. They have an argument there. Where I think their argument breaks down, though, in terms of opposition for these voter ID laws, where I think the opposition breaks down is the fact that it is specifically a racist position or an attempt to suppress votes. Because if that one study is true, that one Reuters study is true, and the statement that they made is true, that the young people who they queried between 18 to 24, that's where that 20,000 group came from. Of that group, they may not be as inclined to vote. And so therefore, whether or not they have ID or voter ID might not even matter. So it's still a bit of a conundrum. I'm not going to say that it's completely cleared up in any way, shape, or form. However, thinking about it and coming up with an idea or coming up with a reason for not having identification seems to be harder the older that you get, because of all the different things that we utilize some form of identification on. Now, as a part of my research, I did take a look. Not every state that does require ID, as I showed you in that graph, requires photo ID. So there were other states that were like, hey, you know, if you can show us that you have some sort of proof of citizenship, like a social security card, or something along those lines, that is considered ID, you can vote. So it's not every single state that actually is looking for voter ID in terms of like a photo ID, not voter ID, but photo ID. So that, you know, again, it's kind of one of those things where I'm not quite sure the people who are opponents to this are sort of twisting the idea that having voter ID laws potentially could lead to voter suppression. However, there is some indication that voter suppression is not happening, at least not in an overt sense, and that the people who may not have them, in terms of the predominant number of people who may not have IDs, meaning those younger people, aren't turning out to vote anyway. And so even though it is a very important American right to vote, and I encourage anyone to vote, regardless of whether you need ID or not, but definitely, and understand that that is an American right, and it is a time-honored tradition. It is something that should not be taken lightly and should be exercised as a right, because there are many places, as we saw in like the freedom of Iraq and stuff, where the Iraqis were running around with their fingers being dipped in purple ink. It is a huge right. And I think regardless, you should make the effort to learn about the policies and everything else and vote. Now, whether or not you're voting in the national elections or not, because, you know, that's a whole nother subject, but realistically, where it matters is locally. And whether there's ID or not ID, you should vote. If you need an ID, try to do your best to get an ID. Because to be honest with you, there's a lot of things that you are missing out on if you don't have ID, if it's required, including some of the services and benefits that you might get if you are in the lower income, like Section 8 housing. That was also listed. So ultimately, did I find out anything different? Well, yes. My eyes were opened. I'm going to be honest. My eyes were opened a little bit to the point of, hey, there is a potential that there is a group of Americans who do not have identification, photo identification, and it is not as prevalent to always have ID. Because of the way that I run in my circles, I am under that fallacy that everyone has an identification. However, that doesn't necessarily mean that we don't move forward with something like voter identification in those states that don't have it, because of the fallacy that is trying to be purported that it is racist. Now, I specifically cut off the Ari Horowitz video because I want to show you he did both sides. So the first one that we saw was the UC Berkeley. And as you can see, they were all mostly young, of ethnic persuasion of white people who were answering this question. So now he goes from UC Berkeley and he heads off to Harlem and he's going to ask that same question. So I'm going to pick up the video from where he heads to Harlem. And hang on.
Now I'm here in East Harlem to ask black people their thoughts on what you just heard. Do you have ID normally? You carry ID around?
Yes, I have state ID.
Do you carry ID?
Yes, I do.
Do you know any black person who doesn't carry ID?
No. Everyone that I know has an ID. Why would they think we don't have ID?
That's a lie. Why would they say that?
Do you have ID?
Yes. Because I have my ID and my friends have their ID, so like, we know what we need to carry around.
Everybody that I know have ID. Like, that's one of the things you need to walk around with New York with, an ID.
Do you know any black adult who does not have ID?
No, I don't.
Is it a weird thing to even say that?
Yes, it is.
What is this, some type of trick candy camera?
I know, right? That's the only thing I brought with me.
Those are legit IDs. I heard a lot also that black people can't figure out how to get to the DMV.
Really?
What does that say to you?
I know it's that. It's on 25th Street.
Do you know where the DMV is around you?
It's on 125th Street and 3rd Avenue, I believe.
You know how to get there?
Yeah.
Did you have a problem getting there if you had to get there?
No.
I know these sound like silly questions. You know how to get to the DMV?
Of course.
You know where it is?
Yes.
You can get there?
Uh-huh.
No problem.
No problem.
Just checking.
Okay.
And I also heard a lot that black people, especially poor black people, have no access to the internet, can't figure out how to use the internet.
That's just stupidity, honestly. Everybody has access to the internet. Even a little kid can figure out how to work the internet.
I had access to the internet for years.
You know how to use it properly, right?
Exactly. I do it at work. So, of course, I know how to use it. My kids know how to use it. They all have iPads, iPods, whatever.
Your phone has data?
Mm-hmm.
You can actually
unlimited.
Unlimited data.
Mm-hmm. I use my phone as a hotspot.
What does that say to you for the people who have this perception of black people?
They're pretty much ignorant. That's what my thought process on it.
I just think that's ignorant.
Okay, so I'm just going to go ahead and stop it there. You get the idea. I honestly think that there is a group of individuals that honestly are afraid to question their own belief systems, they're being given a narrative, they're being given something, and they honestly believe it. I'm not going to say that they don't honestly believe it, but they're also not stepping out of their comfort zone to try and question their potential beliefs, to come up with alternative solutions and opening up their minds in today's day and age to make it to where maybe they could be considered wrong. And that was what my post and my posting of that meme earlier this week on the Facebook and all my social media outlets was basically pointed at, was that you need to question. You need to look beyond what you have in your knowledge base to try and figure out, are you truly following? Are you really correct? Are you truly following your belief system, and is it correct? In certain circumstances, there are certain things that I can understand when somebody goes and says, you know what, I don't believe that, and I'm never going to believe it. And I get that. I understand that. But when it comes to certain things like, when somebody is telling you that a certain segment of the population either can't get an ID because they just don't understand the process or whatever, that sounds crazy. That sounds fake, especially here in the U.S. where we are a first world nation. You need to challenge things like that. And facts and evidence are really important. And that is something that I think we all need to do. We all need to focus on. We all need to move forward with when it comes to questioning things that the news media in particular go ahead and give us. Because if we can't question, if we can't go and use the internet, which is having the internet is the greatest resource book available. Now, granted, there are a lot of fake things on the internet, but generally speaking, it is the best library, because you don't have to go through and dig through the Dewey Decimal System and try to find even the one book that you're looking for, like I did before the internet was invented by Al Gore. Okay. That was a joke. But realistically, you need to take the time to question what you have in front of you, and you'll become a better informed person overall should you do that. And that's my final Whiskey Musings thought for the evening. Thank you very much for joining. Don't forget to hit the subscribe button and the little bell to be notified when I go live. And please do me this favor, if you like the program, definitely subscribe to it, but also try and talk to some other people out there and get them to subscribe too, at least to watch the program and take a look and look at the videos. And if they like them, have them subscribe as well. Thank you, and we'll see you next time on the Whiskey Musings broadcast. Good night.